The photograph is dated 1871. Its caption reads simply, "Market Street, San Francisco." No time of day is listed. The image shows a city already monumental, stone buildings rising 6 and 7 stories, ornate facades aligned with mathematical precision. Streetcar rails run cleanly through the center. Lampposts stand at regular intervals. The architecture implies population, planning, and continuity. But the street is empty. No carts, no pedestrians, no horses, no construction debris, just a finished city without occupants. Official explanations mention long exposure times. Early cameras, they say, erased motion. Yet nearby photographs from the same decade capture crowds frozen mid-stride. And census records from 1870 list San Francisco's population at over 149,000. A city built for hundreds of thousands, photographed as if no one lived there at all. If this were an isolated curiosity, it would be forgettable. But what if it isn't? What if this image is not showing absence, but aftermath? By the late 19th century, textbooks tell us the world was transforming rapidly. Industrialization accelerated construction, immigration fueled cities, railroads stitched continents together. History moved forward in a straight line, slow, cumulative, understandable. Photographs from London, Paris, New York, and Chicago are presented as proof. Soot-covered factories, crowded tenements, streets thick with humanity. Census records reinforce the narrative, population curves rising steadily, decade after decade. Yet even within this orderly framework, anomalies appear. An 1880 U.S. Census supplemental note remarks on irregular urban density reporting in several major cities. No explanation follows. The notation sits buried in Volume 3, a single line among thousands. At first glance, it seems like clerical noise, the sort of administrative friction that emerges in any large-scale data collection effort. But archives are quiet places, and quiet places amplify what doesn't belong. The census note doesn't specify which cities showed irregularity. It doesn't define what irregular meant. It simply acknowledges the discrepancy and moves forward as though the problem resolved itself through acknowledgement alone. This pattern, noting without explaining, documenting without investigating, appears repeatedly in administrative records from the period. Railway construction logs mention inherited infrastructure without elaboration. City planning documents reference restoration of buildings with no prior construction records. Immigration manifests show arrival numbers that don't align with subsequent census totals. Official history works because it feels smooth. Dates connect to dates. Events lead to consequences. The narrative arc bends toward progress, enlightenment, modernity. Friction only appears when you slow down, when you stop reading history as story and start reading it as evidence. The 1880 census irregularity note is friction. Small, easily overlooked, but undeniable. Why would a census acknowledge irregularity without correcting it? Why document a problem and then proceed as though it never existed? The note implies awareness. Someone noticed something wrong with the numbers. Yet no amendment appears in subsequent volumes. No explanation emerges in related correspondence. The irregularity was documented, then buried. Not through active suppression, but through administrative silence, the kind that transforms anomalies into footnotes, then into nothing at all. Architectural records show that cities like St. Louis, Boston, and Philadelphia completed vast stone buildings between 1840 and 1880, courthouses, train stations, hospitals, many with Romanesque and neoclassical detailing rivaling ancient capitals. Construction timelines are often astonishingly short. The St. Louis Old Courthouse renovation, which included a massive cast-iron dome, intricate stonework, and advanced iron structural components, finished in just 4 years between 1839 and 1862. For context, Similar European civic buildings often required decades of continuous work. Photographs taken shortly after completion show pristine exteriors, and again, minimal street life. Wide boulevards extend toward the horizon, empty. Stone facades catch sunlight without a single human shadow interrupting their geometry. Official explanations cite pride in new civic buildings. Photographers, we're told, favored empty shots for clarity, to showcase architecture without visual clutter. Morning hours, when foot traffic was lightest, were supposedly preferred for these commemorative images. Yet postcards from the same era often include handwritten notes. One 1889 postcard from St. Louis, preserved in a Missouri historical collection, reads, "City seems quieter than expected. Buildings magnificent, but streets feel deserted." Another, from Philadelphia in 1882, "Grand architecture everywhere, but where are all the people?" These weren't technical observations. They were impressions from visitors who expected bustling urban centers and found something else instead. The pattern extends beyond American cities. European capitals show the same visual language in photographs from the 1860s and 1870s. The Haussmann renovations in Paris, officially completed in stages between 1853 and 1870, appear in photographs as vast, empty boulevards lined with uniform stone buildings. Melbourne, photographed in 1875, shows ornate Victorian architecture and broad streets, devoid of the crowds that census records claim inhabited the city. Buildings imply builders, builders imply populations, populations imply activity, noise, commerce, movement, the organic chaos of human life. Silence implies interruption. What if these cities were not growing from humble origins into metropolitan centers, but being reused? What if the architecture we see in these photographs predated the population supposedly living within them? Census tables between 1850 and 1900 show explosive population growth in North America and Europe. The United States alone recorded population increases from 23 million in 1850 to over 76 million by 1900, more than tripling in half a century. Immigration narratives fill the gaps. Ellis Island arrivals, westward expansion, industrial labor demand. Each component builds toward a coherent explanation for how empty continents transformed into bustling nations within decades. At the same time, foundling hospitals report unprecedented intakes. The New York Foundling Asylum, established in 1869, recorded over 30,000 children admitted between its opening and 1899. Many arrived with no identifying information, no family names, no known birthplaces, no documentation of any kind. One intake ledger from 1887, preserved in the asylum's archives, repeats a phrase across dozens of entries: origin unknown. Not parents deceased or family unable to care for child, though those entries appear as well. Simply origin unknown, as though the children materialized without history. Some entries note estimated ages that seem inconsistent with physical appearance. Others record children who spoke no recognizable language or dialect. The records do not explain where these children came from, only where they were sent. By the thousands, they were placed with families across rural America, distributed through a system that prioritized dispersal over documentation. The goal, officially, was to remove children from urban poverty and place them in agricultural communities where they could contribute to family labor. But the scale defies simple poverty explanations. 30,000 children through one institution alone. Similar foundling hospitals operated in Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and dozens of smaller cities, each reporting comparable numbers. Demography is a story told in numbers. Birth rates, death rates, immigration rates, these create the population curve. Missing origins distort the plot. When thousands of children appear without documented parents, without recorded births, without traceable genealogy, the curve itself becomes suspect. Why did population growth coincide with mass orphanhood? If immigration fueled the population boom, why did immigrant families simultaneously produce tens of thousands of undocumented children? The narratives don't align, not perfectly. And in the space between immigration records and orphan ledgers, something remains unexplained. Photographs from Paris taken during the 1867 Exposition Universelle show the Champs de Mars and surrounding boulevards in pristine completion. The Haussmann renovations were already finished: wide streets, uniform building heights, gaslighting infrastructure in place. Official attendance records claim millions of visitors over the exposition's 7-month run. Yet photograph after photograph shows empty spaces. The boulevards stretch toward vanishing points without interruption. The exhibition halls appear in wide shots with minimal human presence. Long exposure explains some blur, but it does not explain total absence. In Melbourne, an 1875 photograph captures Collins Street from an elevated position. The street extends for blocks lined with 3- and 4-story stone buildings, awnings, shop windows, and gas lamps. The camera captures every architectural detail with perfect clarity. Not a single human figure appears. Chicago, photographed repeatedly before the 1871 fire and again during reconstruction, shows the same pattern. Wide streets, completed buildings, infrastructure in place, and emptiness. After the fire, the narrative emphasizes rapid rebuilding, thousands of workers, millions of bricks, yet photographs from 1873 show reconstructed blocks that appear pristine and uninhabited. Buenos Aires in the 1880s, Sydney in 1879, San Francisco before and after the 1906 earthquake, saw Montreal in 1867, the year of Canadian Confederation. Each city photographed at moments of supposed peak activity, exhibitions, reconstructions, anniversaries, and each showing minimal street life. Official explanations remain consistent. Early photographers preferred empty streets for visual clarity. Morning shoots minimized crowds, long exposures blurred motion into invisibility. But the pattern crosses continents and decades. It spans different photographic technologies, from daguerreotypes to dry plate negatives. It appears in cities with different climates, different cultural practices, different population densities. Coincidence dissolves when repetition spans geography. One photographer might favor empty streets. A dozen photographers across 20 cities suggest something else, either a coordinated aesthetic choice or something inherent to the subjects themselves. Why do different cities, photographed independently by different practitioners using different technologies, look abandoned in the same decades? What links a Parisian boulevard to a Melbourne thoroughfare to a San Francisco street, besides their emptiness? Perhaps the cameras weren't erasing people. Perhaps for a brief window there simply weren't people to photograph. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 200,000 children were relocated across the United States via the orphan train system. The program, initiated by the Children's Aid Society, transported children from East Coast cities to rural communities throughout the Midwest and West. The scale is unprecedented. No comparable child relocation program existed before or has existed since. Not in wartime, not during natural disasters, not during any other period of American history. Train logs list children in batches, dozens at a time, with minimal accompanying information, names, estimated ages, sometimes a brief physical description. Many records lack birthplaces entirely. Some note simply New York foundling or street child without elaboration. One Illinois placement record from 1892, preserved in a county historical archive, reads, "Child appears older than stated age, no recollection of origin, healthy, suitable for farm work." The phrase, "no recollection of origin," appears repeatedly, not orphaned in infancy or too young to remember. The language suggests something stranger: children who should remember their origins but don't, 7-year-olds, 10-year-olds, even adolescents, placed with no memory of parents, birthplaces, or previous lives. Placement was systematic. Trains arrived in small towns on publicized schedules. Children were displayed, literally placed on platforms or in churches, and selected by families. Some were adopted. Many became indentured laborers. Record-keeping varied widely. Some placements generated legal documents, while others relied on handshake agreements that left no paper trail. By 1929, when the program officially ended, those 200,000 children had dispersed into American society. They became farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, parents, contributors to the same population growth that census records document so neatly. But orphans are not just children without parents, they are people without pasts. When their descendants trace genealogy backward, the line terminates abruptly in a train station in Iowa or Nebraska, with a ledger entry that lists no origin. Where do hundreds of thousands of undocumented children come from? Not from normal demographic processes, not from immigration patterns, not from poverty alone, which creates orphans but doesn't erase their origins. The orphan train system didn't just relocate children, it distributed them, scattered them across enough geography that pattern recognition became nearly impossible. And in doing so, it normalized an entire generation without verifiable history. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, similar architectural features appear with striking consistency. Star forts with geometric precision, cathedral domes using advanced engineering techniques, colonnades echoing classical antiquity, and hydraulic systems embedded beneath city centers. Some are officially attributed to medieval builders working over centuries, others to 19th century engineers applying industrial age principles. The attributions vary by location and academic tradition, but the structures themselves often seem standardized, as though designed according to shared principles. The Moscow Polytechnic Museum, completed in 1877, features electrical infrastructure before widespread grid adoption. Exhibition catalogues from its opening describe modern conveniences, including electric lighting systems that supposedly shouldn't have been available for another decade. The museum's architecture incorporates advanced ventilation, load-bearing innovations, and acoustic design that official histories attribute to visionary engineering. But construction records are sparse. The museum appears in city planning documents as renovated facility rather than new construction. No labor logs survive, no detailed architectural plans remain in archives. The building simply appears in photographs, complete, functional, and technically advanced. This pattern repeats across major cities. The Paris Opera House, officially completed in 1875 after 14 years of construction, shows architectural sophistication that seems disproportionate to contemporary building practices. Photographs from the 1878 Exposition Universelle reveal exhibition halls with clear-span roofs and structural systems that official narratives credit to cutting-edge engineering. Yet, similar techniques appear in buildings decades older. In Philadelphia, the Memorial Hall from the 1876 Centennial Exhibition remained standing long after other temporary structures were demolished. Its construction allegedly took mere months, yet its massive dome and stone facade suggested permanence rather than expedience. Star forts, defensive structures with geometric precision and sophisticated sight lines, appear across 4 continents, attributed to periods spanning 3 centuries. Yet they share design principles so consistent that modern military historians struggle to explain how isolated regions developed identical solutions. Technology leaves fingerprints, construction methods, material choices, structural engineering solutions. These fingerprints should show progression, regional variation, trial and error. Instead, they show standardization. Who standardized these designs across empires? If each city developed independently, why do their infrastructure systems, hydraulic networks, street grids, building codes align so precisely. Official histories credit parallel development, shared knowledge transfer through academic channels, universal engineering principles. But standardization usually requires coordination, and coordination requires either contemporary communication or inheritance of existing templates. By 1893, the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition unveiled an entire city, the White City, built in just over 2 years. Its scale rivaled permanent capitals. Over 200 buildings covered more than 600 acres, connected by canals, electric railways, and illuminated by thousands of electric lights. The architecture was ornate, symmetrical, and monumental. The Court of Honor featured massive neoclassical buildings with columns, domes, and sculptural details that evoked ancient Rome. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building alone covered 30 acres under a single roof, larger than any enclosed space previously constructed. Officially, the structures were temporary, built from staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and fibre designed to mimic stone. The plan called for demolition after the fair closed. Contemporary accounts describe the city as magnificent but ephemeral, a dream constructed for a season. Photographs taken during demolition, however, show something unexpected. Stone facades, not plaster, heavy masonry foundations, structural systems that suggest permanence rather than temporary exhibition space. Exhibition catalogues list architectural firms responsible for design: Daniel Burnham as chief architect, Frederick Law Olmsted for landscape design. But labor force documentation is peculiar. Official sources mention thousands of workers without specific numbers. Payroll records, if they existed, haven't survived in accessible archives. The timeline itself strains credibility. Contemporary construction of similar scale projects typically required decades. The Palace of Versailles took 50 years. The US Capitol, even with multiple construction phases, spanned over 30 years of active work. Yet Chicago allegedly erected an entire neoclassical city with advanced electrical systems, plumbing, and structural engineering in 26 months. Other world fairs show similar patterns. The 1889 Exposition Universelle in Paris featured the Eiffel Tower and the Gallery of Machines, both completed in under 2 years. The 1851 Crystal Palace in London, a cast iron and glass structure covering 990,000 square feet, supposedly rose in less than 6 months. Temporary cities should not look eternal. Exhibition spaces should not require demolition with industrial equipment typically reserved for permanent structures. Why does a fair resemble a capital? Why do temporary exhibition halls require the same architectural sophistication as cathedrals and government buildings? Official explanations cite ambition, national pride, engineering innovation. But perhaps the buildings weren't constructed for the fairs. Perhaps the fairs were constructed to explain the buildings. The same decades, 1850 to 1900, show convergence across multiple domains. Empty city photographs span from San Francisco to Melbourne. Orphan redistribution systems operate simultaneously in North America and Europe. Population normalization occurs in census records that previously showed irregularities. Monumental infrastructure appears in cities that, according to earlier records, were frontier outposts or modest regional centers. This is not a local anomaly confined to one city's photographic record or one nation's demographic quirk. It is a timeline, a synchronized pattern across continents, institutions, and documentation types. Consider the sequence. First, photographs show completed cities without inhabitants. Then, orphan systems distribute hundreds of thousands of children without documented origins. Finally, census records show population growth that fills the empty cities, growth attributed to immigration and natural increase, but coinciding precisely with orphan placement and unexplained demographic shifts. The official narrative treats each element independently. Photography receives one explanation, technical limitations. Orphans receive another, urban poverty and charitable response. Population growth receives a third, immigration and industrialization. Architecture receives a fourth, engineering progress and civic ambition, but independence requires isolation. When the same time period produces the same pattern across different evidence types in different locations, independence becomes implausible. Patterns are stories history didn't mean to tell. They emerge from cross-referencing archives that were never intended to be read together. A photograph in San Francisco, a census irregularity note in Washington, an orphan train log in Kansas, an exhibition catalogue in Chicago. Separately, each is an artifact. Together they form something else, a shadow narrative that runs parallel to official history. The synchronicity extends to institutional responses. When questions arise about empty photographs, explanations emphasize technical constraints. When questions arise about orphan origins, explanations emphasize poverty and charity. When questions arise about rapid construction, explanations emphasize innovation and labor availability. Each explanation is reasonable in isolation. All explanations become problematic in aggregate. What event could precede all of this? What disruption would require simultaneous repopulation, architectural reuse, and narrative reconstruction? The question demands speculation that exceeds available evidence, but the evidence itself demands the question. History is supposed to be continuous. Cause leads to effect. Generations succeed generations. Cities grow from villages. But when photographs show cities already complete, when children appear without origins, when census records acknowledge irregularities without explanation, continuity fractures, and in the fracture, another possibility emerges. Speculative researchers examining these convergent anomalies have proposed what some call the reset hypothesis, the idea that a disruptive event, environmental, social, or technological, depopulated vast regions during the mid-19th century. What followed was not gradual recovery, but systematic repopulation. Not birth by birth, family by family, but placement by placement, organized redistribution of surviving populations into existing infrastructure. The hypothesis suggests that cities like San Francisco, Chicago, Paris, and Melbourne were not built by their 19th century inhabitants, but inherited. The architecture predated the population. The infrastructure existed before the census records showed inhabitants to use it. This interpretation reframes the photographic evidence. Empty streets weren't technical artifacts. They were documentary evidence of transition periods. The cities were there. The people were not yet placed within them. It reframes the orphan systems. The children weren't products of urban poverty, but survivors, collected, redistributed, and integrated into populations that needed demographic foundation. And their lack of documented origins wasn't administrative failure, but inherent characteristic. They had no origins within the new timeline. It reframes census irregularities. The 1880 note about irregular urban density reporting wasn't clerical error, but evidence of population reconstruction. Initial counts showed emptiness, subsequent counts showed sudden occupation. The irregularity was the transition itself, documented but unexplainable within the continuous growth narrative. Census growth curves examined closely flattened strangely after initial spikes. Population should grow exponentially with immigration, compounding as new arrivals reproduce. Instead, growth rates normalize quickly, as though populations reach target numbers, then stabilized artificially. World fairs become explicable under this framework. They weren't showcasing new construction, but repurposing existing structures, demonstrating that inherited infrastructure could serve contemporary purposes. The exhibitions normalized the architecture by attributing it to present-day engineers and laborers. The hypothesis doesn't require conspiracy, it requires disruption, followed by reconstruction, not of buildings which remained largely intact, but of narrative. History was rewritten not through active deception but through managed silence. Uncomfortable questions about origins and timelines were deflected with reasonable-sounding technical explanations. Gaps in genealogy were attributed to record-keeping failures. Architectural sophistication was credited to engineering genius. Resets don't announce themselves. They normalize quietly, generation by generation, until the disruption becomes invisible beneath accumulated consensus. What if we inherited the world instead of building it? What if the cities, the infrastructure, the architectural legacy we attribute to 19th century industrialization actually predated the populations we believe constructed them? The question violates historical continuity, but continuity itself, examined through these accumulated anomalies, appears to violate the evidence. By the early 20th century, standardized education emerges across Western nations. Public schooling becomes compulsory. Textbooks adopt unified narratives. Historical timelines simplify, compress, and align. Older maps disappear from circulation. Architectural origins are reattributed. Buildings once listed as renovated or restored in 19th century documents become credited to specific contemporary architects in 20th century histories. The language shifts from inheritance to creation. This isn't necessarily malicious. Standardization serves practical purposes: shared knowledge frameworks, unified national narratives, simplified pedagogy. But standardization also erases complexity. Anomalies that don't fit the timeline get smoothed away. Photographs that show empty cities become curiosities explained by technical limitations rather than evidence of disruption. The 1880 census irregularity note vanishes from popular historical consciousness. It remains in archives, available to anyone who examines Volume 3 closely, but it disappears from historical discourse. Later, census analyses don't reference it. Historical demography textbooks don't acknowledge it. The irregularity, once documented, becomes undocumented through disuse. Orphan train histories are reframed as charitable programs addressing urban poverty. The scale, 200,000 children, becomes a testament to 19th century social reform rather than an anomaly requiring explanation. The missing origins become administrative gaps rather than genealogical impossibilities. World fairs are celebrated as showcases of innovation. The speed of construction becomes evidence of American ambition and engineering prowess rather than evidence of architectural reuse. Photographs of demolition showing stone rather than plaster are filed away, uncatalogued, forgotten. Silence becomes policy, not through official decree but through editorial choice. What gets taught, what gets published, what gets emphasized in historical narratives shapes collective memory more powerfully than any government censorship. Control of history begins with control of memory, and control of memory begins with control of what questions are asked. If textbooks don't mention census irregularities, students won't ask about them. If architectural histories attribute buildings to contemporary engineers without acknowledging documentation gaps, architects won't question the timeline. If genealogy researchers accept that records are incomplete due to fires, floods, and administrative failures, they won't examine patterns of systematic absence. The standardization of education in the early 20th century created consensus, and consensus, once established, becomes self-reinforcing. Alternative interpretations face not suppression, but dismissal, relegated to fringe discourse, easily ignored by mainstream scholarship. Who benefits from a shortened past? Perhaps no one consciously, but institutions benefit from simplified narratives. Nations benefit from heroic origin stories. Populations benefit from stable identity frameworks. And in the space between stability and truth, the anomalies persist. waiting in archives for investigators willing to question consensus. Millions of people trace their ancestry to the late 1800s and find nothing before. The family tree extends backward through 20th century generations, grandparents, great-grandparents, then terminates abruptly in the 1870s or 1880s with a single entry: orphan, foundling, immigrant, with no listed origin. Genealogy websites contain thousands of such dead ends. Forums discuss strategies for researching brick wall ancestors, individuals who appear in records without precedent. The advice is practical: check immigration manifests, search orphanage records, examine naturalization documents. The assumption is that records exist somewhere if only researchers look hard enough. But what if the records don't exist? What if the brick walls aren't research failures but inherent characteristics, termination points where genealogy meets the timeline's edge? Foundling records replace bloodlines, adoption papers replace birth certificates, immigration manifests list arrivals but no departures from previous locations. The documentation shows appearance without origin, as though entire populations materialized at ports, train stations, and foundling hospitals, carrying nothing from before. This creates a peculiar demographic pattern. Vast portions of the contemporary population descend from individuals who have no verifiable ancestry before 1870. The genealogical void is so widespread it's normalized, treated as unfortunate but unremarkable, an artifact of poor record-keeping in a chaotic century. Yet record-keeping was not uniformly poor. European church registries maintained birth and death records for centuries. Asian genealogical traditions tracked lineages across dynasties. Even American frontier communities kept basic vital records. The gaps are selective, concentrated in the same decades that show empty photographs and orphan surges. Identity collapses when origins vanish. Who are you if your family history extends back only 3 generations? What cultural continuity remains when ancestral knowledge terminates in a Kansas train station with a ledger entry reading origin unknown? For most, this doesn't matter practically. Daily life doesn't require deep genealogy, but culturally, symbolically, the void is profound. We are people without deep roots, inheritors of surnames we may not have earned, descendants of foundlings who may not be our actual ancestors. The reset hypothesis suggests an explanation. We are successors, not descendants. Our genealogy terminates because it begins, not biologically but socially, in the late 19th century. The population that existed before left architecture, infrastructure, and skeletal frameworks. The population that exists now filled those frameworks. Are we descendants or successors? The question transforms from philosophical to historical, and the answer, if found, would rewrite not just family trees but collective identity itself. If history can be edited, so can consensus. Not through dramatic falsification, burning books, destroying monuments, executing dissidents, but through quieter means: omission, reframing, administrative silence. The census irregularity note demonstrates the mechanism: document the anomaly, then proceed without addressing it. Future historians see the note, assume it was resolved, and move forward. The irregularity remains in the archive, technically accessible, but functionally invisible beneath layers of subsequent interpretation. This creates a peculiar trust problem. How do you dispute absence? Fabricated documents can be exposed through forensic analysis. False claims can be contradicted by counter-evidence. But what counter-evidence exists for something that was never recorded? If thousands of children appeared without documented origins, how do you prove they should have had origins? The absence of birth records becomes evidence only if you assume birth records should exist. If you accept that record-keeping was incomplete, the absence becomes unremarkable. Institutional reality, the consensus version of events that governments, universities, and media outlets endorse, functions through such assumptions. It treats the official narrative as default, requiring skeptics to provide extraordinary evidence for alternative interpretations. Empty photographs are technical artifacts unless proven otherwise. Orphans are poverty victims unless proven otherwise. Rapid construction is engineering achievement unless proven otherwise. The burden of proof falls on questioners, not on the narrative itself, and that burden becomes nearly impossible when the questioned elements involve absence rather than presence. Consider what's required to challenge the standard timeline. You must find photographs showing empty cities, but dismiss official explanations about exposure times. You must document orphan surges, but reject charitable poverty narratives. You must identify census irregularities, but insist they indicate population reconstruction rather than clerical errors. You must examine architectural timelines, but argue they're impossibly short despite official records. Each challenge requires dismissing reasonable-sounding explanations. Taken individually, this seems paranoid. Why invent complex alternative histories when simple technical or social explanations suffice? But patterns aren't individual, they're aggregate, and in aggregate, the explanations start requiring their own leaps of faith. Trust institutional reality and history makes sense. Question it, and you enter territory where evidence becomes ambiguous, where every document contains potential misdirection, where the official story becomes suspect not through disproven claims but through accumulated improbabilities. Absence is harder to dispute than falsehood. You can't disprove what was never claimed. You can only notice that something feels wrong, that the timeline doesn't quite align, that origins terminate too abruptly, that cities appear too complete. What else was quietly removed? The question has no boundary. And that's precisely what makes it disturbing. We return to Market Street, San Francisco, 1871. The photograph still exists. The caption still reads simply, Market Street, San Francisco. The stone buildings still rise 6 and 7 stories. The streetcar rails still run cleanly through the center. The lampposts still stand at regular intervals. The street is still empty. What once looked like a technical artifact, long exposure erasing pedestrians, now feels like something else. Not absence, but documentation. A moment captured between populations, infrastructure, waiting. The photograph didn't change, we did. After examining orphan records, census irregularities, architectural impossibilities and synchronized patterns across continents, the image transforms. It's no longer a curiosity explained by camera limitations. It's evidence, fragile, ambiguous, but persistent, of a gap in continuity. Official history tells us San Francisco in 1871 was a bustling city, rebuilding after fires, absorbing immigrants, expanding infrastructure to accommodate explosive growth. The census recorded 149,000 inhabitants. The photograph shows none. Both cannot be fully true. Either the photograph misrepresents reality through technical limitation, which requires accepting that dozens of similar photographs from different cities, different decades, and different camera technologies all shared the same flaw. Or the photograph documents a moment of transition when infrastructure existed before populations fully inhabited it, when cities were present but people were still being distributed into them. The reset hypothesis offers an explanation, but explanation requires accepting discontinuity. It requires believing that history doesn't flow smoothly from past to present, but includes fracture points, moments when narrative was reconstructed, when timelines were compressed, when inherited infrastructure was reattributed to contemporary builders. Accepting this means accepting that millions of family trees terminate legitimately, that census records contain real irregularities, that orphan systems redistributed survivors rather than rescued poverty victims, that world fairs showcased existing structures rather than temporary exhibitions, that empty photographs documented reality rather than technical failures, The cost of acceptance is high. It means living outside consensus. It means trusting pattern recognition over institutional authority. It means carrying knowledge that contradicts textbooks, encyclopedias, and expert scholarship. What moment came before the shutter clicked? What preceded the empty street and what followed? Official history says that nothing preceded it except gradual growth. The photograph, now burdened with accumulated evidence, suggests something else. The archive closes, the lamplight dims. One census column remains unexplained. One photograph refuses context. One generation appears without parents. History calls it progress. But progress doesn't usually require forgetting. If this was a reset, what was erased? And more importantly, who were we before we were told who we are?